Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mist, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. And today, in this Ravenloft video, we're going to be talking about another Domain of Dread. I think this is my 5th or 6th Domain of Dread, how I ran domain video now. Let's see, we had the Carnival, Falkovnia, Sea of Sorrows, Demonio, Valachance, the 6th. This is Markovia. Quick disclaimer before we begin, with some of the other videos, a lot of it is kind of like ideas dump stuff. So I'm not saying this is an adventure you run from this level to this level, start to finish. I essentially say this is what I did, borrow what you want, don't borrow what you don't want, and so on. However, with some of the other ones I've done, for example, I guess Falkovnia with the Zombie Siege and Valachance with the Trial of Hearts, you probably could just grab what I did and maybe amend it depending on the levels of your players and the characters. But essentially, yeah, you could just run it as it is and have at it. With this one though, this is a bit of a weird one. So basically they visited Markovia 3 times for different reasons each time, and each time was almost like a quick pit stop, maybe a session or two. The reasons they visited were very specific to my campaign. So I would treat this more as just ideas and inspiration and flavour for if and when you run Markovia, and not necessarily as something you can literally just grab and fit into your campaign. So I just want to make that very clear to begin with. So Markovia's lore in the old Ravenloft lore versus 5th edition, it's a bit of a funny one. So there was a module in, I believe it was 2nd edition, called Neither Man Nor Beast. I'll talk about that later. And essentially is a mad scientist who creates people with who are part humanoid and part beast, and they're referred to as the Broken Ones. Now, anyone who's played Curse of Strahd in 5th edition will think, oh, that sounds very much like the Abbey of St. Markovia, do you see what they did there? With the abbot as the mad scientist and the mongrel folk, the Belleviews, as the Broken Ones. And that is essentially because what I think they did, with Curse of Strahd coming out about, gosh, I think it was like 5 or 6 years before Van Richten's guide came out, I think what they tried to do is, the Abbey of St. Markovia was a homage to the old Markovia lore. So Curse of Strahd and Barovia was obviously based on old Strahd Barovia lore, and then they added this element in where they kind of borrowed from there. Maybe at the time they weren't sure if they were going to expand Ravenloft as a setting, and if they did, maybe they weren't going to include Markovia. But then when Van Richten's guide came out and Markovia was mentioned, in order to avoid doubling up, they changed it from beast people, Broken Ones, to sapient animals. And I went with that as well, solely because I'd already run Curse of Strahd and the mongrel folk in Krezk, that I didn't want the same thing again, where they go to an island and it's exactly like Krezk and the mongrel folk. So I went with the whole sapient animals angle as suggested in 5th edition. Let's talk about resources now. Van Richten's guide doesn't really offer that much. Markovia is what I call a minor domain. The major domains are the ones that have multiple pages per domain and usually have a map as well. But in the case of Markovia, it's literally a paragraph. So what I did to get flavour and get ideas and get maps and get information about locations was I got Neither Man Nor Beast from DM's Guild. I'll include a link in the description. And I didn't use a lot of it. I didn't like run it out of the module, out of the book. I mostly just used it for the flavour and for the maps and the location info. So flavour-wise, all I really did was borrowed a few things, one of which was just the fact that Dr. Frantisek Markov, the Darklord, is referred to as Dr. Fran. I love that. That's kind of like, I can see the animals kind of referring to him as Dr. Fran as kind of like an affectionate nickname rather than Dr. Markov, which sounds more serious and more formal. In terms of the locations, it was great for getting information about the Markov estate and the Monastery to the south, which are the 2 main locations. Another source of handy information as well was a guide I found that somebody put on the Ravenloft subreddit about Markovia for 5th edition by a user called Mearshoe1981. I think I mentioned it before because I think they did a guide on the Sea of Sorrows, and I used that when I did the Sea of Sorrows. And they essentially talk about how you could run it in 5th edition and what kinds of monsters you could include and what stat blocks to use. And yeah, it does borrow a lot from Neither Man Nor Beast, and some stuff is essentially like the Table of Life, I think is literally copy and pasted from that module. Still really handy to have, and really appreciate the work that Mearshoe1981 does. So if they're watching this, thank you very much. In terms of maps, the island map as a whole, I mean, there might be stuff in old lore, but I really struggled when I looked online, and I ended up finding this one, which looks to be a fan-made map by, I think his name is Gomez, in the Fraternity of Shadows. I'm assuming it's the same Fraternity of Shadows that also do Mistopedia, the sort of Ravenloft wiki, which has also been really handy in the past. So I used this map. And then in terms of the maps of the estate and the monastery, as mentioned just now, they appear in neither man nor beast. I found this Reddit user called MaxLeMaze who created the maps in their own style, I think using something like Dungeon Draft, and I think they look fantastic for both the estate and for the monastery. So big thank you to MaxLeMaze for posting those on Reddit. I used them and thought they were really good. In terms of music, I often have these moments where I say, oh, I like tabletop audio and I like using the music. I only really used 3 songs, and that was Invisible Mountain, which I used for when they just explored the island. I think that was the same music I used for Valachan. The Orrery, which I used for the estate, which is kind of almost religious, almost monk-like. Quite fittingly, it was the music I used for the Abbey of St. Markovia in Kresk, so there was also the tie-in there. And for the monastery, when they eventually got there, I used the Great Lift. And I only really used it because there is a big lift, hoists people up to the monastery. And I listened to it and I was like, oh, that actually kind of fits the location as a whole. I used the music-only version, so you even got the sound of the lift going the whole time, and kind of just had that for when they were exploring the monastery. So the hook I used for them going to Markovia was a bit of an odd one, I'll be honest. I think there's going to be a lot of moments in this video where I say long story short, and I'll try my best to be as succinct as possible, not to digress too much. But the reason they found out about Markovia and the reason that they went to Markovia is because during Curse of Strahd, they had Rictavio as their fated ally in the fight against Strahd. Rictavio is the disguise of Dr. Rudolf van Richten. As part of the disguise, he had a carnival wagon with a tiger inside it, which, unbeknownst to the PCs, the players, he had previously trained to hunt Vistani. I say previously trained because at one point I had it that he changed his mind and decided to train it against the undead instead, to, fight vampires and vampire spawn and whatever else that was undead. Anyway, long story short, there's the first time I've said this. I'm going to have to count how many times I say that. During one of the times they were on the Svarlich Road in Barovia, they passed some Vistani, the tiger escaped and attacked them. They managed to save some of the Vistani, some got killed, and they managed to get the tiger back into the wagon. That's when they realised what Rictavio / Van Richten had done. They were really upset with him, and they decided to turn him into the Vistani. There was a trial and everything. I talk about it more in a video about homebrew changes I made to Curse of Strahd. I'll do the thing where a link appears, I can never remember which side when I'm recording, and it'll be in the description, or below the description as well. Rictavio was found innocent due to insufficient evidence. They basically didn't show the Vistana at all. He was told that he would have been exiled to Valachan if he'd been found guilty rather than being executed. How fitting that the guy who trained a tiger to attack people would be chased and hunted by similar monsters. And for the safety of the tiger, instead of putting it down, they decided they were going to ship it off to this island called Markovia, where animals can be re-educated, and and it would be like a sort of sanctuary for the tiger. So that was they heard about it halfway through Curse of Strahd, and so when they finished Curse of Strahd, they defeated Strahd and could leave Barovia. They knew of a few places they'd go to, one of which was Markovia, where they knew that the tiger was being sent to, and they were thinking, hey, we're going to Volkovnia next, where there's loads of zombies. Having a saber-toothed tiger that wants to fight the undead would be pretty cool and pretty handy to have. Now, in terms of how to get to Markovia, I wouldn't say I made a mistake here, but I think I would have done things differently looking back. So basically, Markovia is technically part of the Sea of Sorrows. At this point in the game, I didn't know if I was going to introduce the Sea of Sorrows, so I just had it as an island. It was just a self-contained domain. So when they left Barovia with their Mist Talisman to take them to Markovia, no, they didn't have a Mist Talisman, actually, which was a whole thing I'll get to in a minute. They basically left Barovia, went through the mists, and appeared at Markovia's borders, which was essentially its shoreline. If I'd introduced the Sea of Sorrows at that point, then maybe I would have said they'd have to get a ship from somewhere and sail there, but I basically said that they could just arrive, bypass the need for ship travel, and arrive from Barovia or any other domain that they can leave from, and just arrive in Markovia. When they first arrived on their first visit, because they didn't have a Mist Talisman, this is my own sort of homebrew, this isn't official as far as I know. I have it where if you go to a domain and you don't have a Mist Talisman, there's a risk you can invite Sorrowsworn into the domain. Sorrowsworn are mentioned in, I believe it's Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and updated in Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse. They are these horrific monsters who are described as being like sort of lost in the mists and lost in the Shadowfell, so they're kind of perfect for Ravenloft. and they got attacked by some. And in 2 hits, they're pretty strong, pretty deadly. And in 2 hits, one of them nearly killed Viktor Valakovich, who was one of their NPC allies from their time in Barovia and Curse of Strahd. As the battle happened on the shore, the beach in Markovia, 2 bears start running up to them, and they're like, uh-oh, now we've got bears to deal with as well. But the bears help them and start attacking the Sorrowsworn. And one of them speaks and says, "We will help you fight this monster." And they were like, did that bear just speak? They fight the Sorrowsworn, defeat it, and they have a conversation with the 2 bears, because the bears can talk and are super intelligent. And I think I played it, one was a polar bear and one was a brown bear, and one was from a rescue from a zoo and the other was just a wild animal. And they were 2 people who had been given sapience by Dr. Fran, and they said, "Let us take you to the estate in the centre of the island." At that point, my players asked, did a tiger, an armoured saber-toothed tiger come here recently? And they're like, yes, she's here. In my game, she was a she. And they were like, yes, we'll take you to her now. They get to the estate. Again, as I said, I used the sort of fan-made map on Reddit, and I used the information for the different rooms and the layout from Neither Man Nor Beast. And they meet Dr. Fran. Dr. Fran was quite an interesting one to roleplay. Again, I didn't really do from Neither Man Nor Beast where he's evil and he's got his own goals and after the Table of Life. I played him as quite, I wouldn't say good, I guess more neutral. He definitely wasn't, well, get more into how he's evil. They find that out more on the 3rd visit. But at least in terms of when they visit and they see the tiger now talked to them. Was like, "I remember you from Barovia," which is quite funny. But yeah, they meet Dr. Fran, and Dr. Fran's friendly to them and accommodating. And I like the fact as well that I didn't want all the Domains of Dread to basically be all the borders are closed, like Strahd and Barovia. All the Darklords are evil, obviously evil. Whenever you go to a domain, you're trapped and have to defeat the leader. And Dr. Fran was quite friendly to them, as basically said, people can come and go as they please. He realised that's probably a good way to spread the word about, if you know of any animals who need relocating, coming to my island, which is like a sanctuary, and I can help them, please, do that. And if he closes the borders, that's not going to happen. Role-playing him, I had a bit of a laugh with him, so I played him as basically like a doctor and a scientist, but every now and again he would just make a random animal sound, which my players found hilarious at first, but it did get a bit old fast, where he'd explain something and then all of a sudden just say, "Ribbit," and look a bit confused, and then again you'd just be talking about something and then in the middle of a sentence, "Bakak!" and things like that. And maybe that's a bit silly and a bit slapstick compared to how Dr. Fran was in Neither Man Nor Beast, but that's just the way I wanted to roleplay him, and that's just what came to mind when I had him. And then when I noticed my players would kind of it was getting a bit old and they were getting a bit fed up with it, I reduced how often it happened, but then just out of nowhere he might just suddenly do like a horse's neigh and then just carry on talking like nothing happened. They recruited Rictavio's tiger, who we nicknamed Resef Jr. Long story short, Resef was the name of a player who was at Tabaxi, a player character I should say. I don't have real life Tabaxiers people, I know. And they named the tiger after that character. And they were like, "We're going to Volkovnia, do you want to come? There's zombies." And she was like, "Heck yes, let's go." And Dr. Fran thanked them and said, "You're welcome back anytime, please bring more animals, please spread the word, blah blah blah." And that was it. That was literally like a session or 2. And as they were leaving the island, I should have mentioned before, they met some of the other animals, and I think I borrowed names from Neither Man Nor Beast of some of the broken ones and just repurposed them for different animals. So there was a baboon called Felix and an ape called Orson, who were Dr. Fran's 2 main lab assistants because they had fingers and hands, being monkey and ape-like creatures. And there were all sorts of animals at the thing. I just basically grabbed loads of different beast tokens and put them on, and it was quite funny having, you had a mix of things like wolves and lions having conversations with sheep and cows, like they were all best mates. I had it as well that when the animals gained intelligence, they then felt guilty eating other animals, so they they all became vegan. So this intelligent talking saber-toothed tiger that likes to hunt the undead is now vegan as well, or maybe vegetarian, I can't remember. Maybe, I think they felt a bit funny about, say, eating the eggs of a chicken, for example. So that was kind of sidestepped the whole thing about how, you've got lions and wolves and sheep and cows, and the former want to eat the latter. Anyway, I'm digressing. Guilty, again, of doing that. They go to leave the island, and shortly after they leave, Felix, the baboon, approaches them. And I can't remember exactly how I played it, because this was about 2 years ago in game, our game, obviously. And he said something like, "I don't like Dr. Fran's rule. I think the animals should take over the island. Viva la revolution." And said something like that, and said, "If you want to join us, come meet us at the Monastery to the south of the island. We'll be waiting." And this was really cool, because then they had big decisions to make. Do they leave the island and let Markovia sort out Markovia's problems? Do they go to the island and warn Dr. Fran or confront Dr. Fran? Do they go to the monastery and talk it out or join the cause or fight Felix and the animals who have decided they want to revolt against Dr. Fran and Dr. Fran's rule? Although he's a very sort of easygoing leader, as some of the Darklords and leaders go. In the end, they decided to leave the domain, which was fair enough. They were like, well, let's just go to Falkovnia and see if this becomes an issue later on. I was a little gutted because I'd already prepared the monastery map, and then I was like, oh no. I've spent hours preparing the map, put it into Roll20, doing dynamic lighting and adding the doors and windows and walls, and they're not going to go to it. But they do go to it in the future, so it wasn't all for nothing. They did Falkovnia, they did a few other domains, and their second visit came as a result of something that happened in the Sea of Sorrows. So they have a magic item called Luba's Rock of Souls. It's in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I've done a video all about Luba's Rock of Souls because I think it's an amazing addition to a Ravenloft campaign. And one of the side effects it has is you can use it and it has this ability where it can impose disadvantage or advantage on somebody, but there's a small chance that a monster escapes from it. And this has happened a few times, and then they either used this ability on either Pietra, or I think it might have been fighting a sea serpent on the way to Pietra. They used the Tarokadak and a monster escaped. And they didn't know where the monster had gone until later when they went back to their base in Barovia. They were visited by a Bloodhawk who looked familiar, and it was a Bloodhawk they met briefly in Markovia. And it could talk, obviously. And it said, "We need your help. A monster just suddenly appeared on Markovia and was going to attack the Markov estate. And I was sent here to try and find you here, and one of my fellow sapient animals was sent to the carnival to try and recruit Rictavia's tiger, because that's after Falkovnia, the talking tiger joined the carnival. So they were like, oh, right, okay. Instead of heading to the carnival, I think they went straight to Markovia. And the way the timeline worked, I think the tiger had already arrived at the estate. They went to Markovia, they got to the estate, and they found that Dr. Fran had died. He'd been killed by this mummy lord that had appeared on the island, passed the estate, and Dr. Fran, in an attempt to protect the animals, tried to fight the mummy lord and was defeated by the mummy lord, and then headed south towards the monastery. They noticed as well, they saw Dr. Fran's dead body, that he had grown in size in terms of size categories. In D&D, he was now large instead of medium, and had gotten a lot more bestial, sort of grown in size and hairy and things like that. They decided to go to the monastery to fight the mummy lord. As I mentioned earlier, the map's already done at this point, so I was like, hey, not much prep I need to do. And they used the lift to go up. And in neither man nor beast, the monastery is populated by, I can't remember without looking it up, I think they're like mummy type people. They've been affected by being in close proximity to the Table of Life for so long. But I had it empty. And the reason I did this was if they did visit to confront the people who were planning the revolution, the revolt against Dr. Fran, it would have been odd if there were also loads of monsters there. So I had it as this empty, abandoned monastery. But the mummy lord had sensed the Table of Life and been drawn to it. And when they got there, not only was there a mummy lord, but there was a bunch of skeleton minions as well, because mummy lords have the spell Animate Dead. And so I said that maybe it found some of the old monks of the monastery in the sort of catacombs or whatever it is, or the tunnels underneath the monastery, and summoned and essentially had a small skeleton army as well. So make it as well that there wasn't just one enemy they were fighting, albeit a tough enemy, but it had lots of minions as well. You have the battle inside the sort of chapel or church area of the monastery, and the mummy lord at one point stands on the table and they're hitting it loads, and they're thinking this thing must be dead by now, and it still just keeps fighting. And then eventually one of them manages to shove it off the table, and then I described it as in like all the damage that happened while it was on the table and was catching up to it, like that's me doing an impression of somebody in that situation apparently. I don't know, I might edit that out because that was probably a bit weird. We'll see, that's probably going to make it in actually. So they defeat the mummy lord and then they identify the Table of Life, and I used the information from the original Neither Man Nor Beast module to explain what it was. And essentially any sort of pain or damage that anyone takes while on the table doesn't kill them. So horrific things can be done to people, and unless they leave the table, they continue to live. And you imagine someone like the Darklord, I think her name's Victor Mordenheim of Lemordia, having something like this with her experiments could use really well. I haven't run Lemordia, nor do I intend to, but it's a good potential thing and tie in there. I think I got that from the Mearshu guide, which I mentioned, Mearshu, the Reddit user I mentioned earlier, as a potential hook, or maybe I got that from someone else. Apology if it's not them. And this freaked them out, and they managed to get hold of a necklace of prayer beads, and one of the spells it can do is Planar Ally. Now, long story short, again, I've said it, they previously saved the life of a Deva. Long story short, this was because I ran Naranjan and I used PhD&D's version of it, which was borrowed from a Candlekeep Mysteries adventure. And in that, and I can't remember if it's in the original adventure or Dr. Bowers' Amends, there is a Deva who's scripted to die, but one of my characters decided to cast Revivify. So they saved the life of a Deva now who now owed them a favour, and she helped them to take down Pietra, the Darklord of the Sea of Sorrows. And so they tried to summon her through the necklace of prayer beads Planar Ally, and a different Deva arrived and explained that that Deva they were friends with, her name was Silvari, was busy doing other stuff. I won't go into the reasons why, but she could help on her behalf. They explained about the table, and they said usually, calling us a favour, it requires a huge payment, but because you saved Silvari, and because this is a horrible evil table, we will remove it. And she summoned a couple more Deva, and the Devas picked up the table, took it away. So the table of life was gone. They go back to the Markov estate, and they arrive as a funeral and burial is happening to Dr. Fran, and Felix, the would-be revolutionary and main lab assistant, talks about how he was moved. He didn't like Dr. Fran, but he was moved by Dr. Fran's sacrifice to save them. And all of a sudden the ground starts to rumble, and Dr. Fran emerges from the earth, and he's alive. And it's because of the whole, he was sort of using like the play dead ability. I think there's some animals have. I think there's some animals as well who can even like play dead to the point where they like stop their heartbeat or something like that, or they can make themselves go cold. So I basically said he kind of adapted that ability. So he wasn't actually dead, he was just faking death or went into some sort of like mini coma and had now awakened and wanted to carry on doing experiments. And Felix changed his mind about the coup and the revolution, and considers him God now, especially because he's sort of come back to life, essentially, although he didn't really die, but you get what I mean. And so the animals change their tune, and they kind of consider him more of a god now, which kind of ties in true to both, I think, the original lore and the 5th edition lore as well. So I didn't introduce that kind of element until this point now. That was their second visit. Their third visit was after they'd finished Valachan. Now, I did a whole other video about Valachan. And Valachan, long story short, again, sorry, the domain basically destroyed itself, and they managed to evacuate the people of Shuran, the people of Ocello, and they found the tiger went with them. I left the carnival for a bit and went with them, and they found the tiger's original saber-tooth tiger family, which suggests that Van Richten originally acquired the tiger from Valachan. They moved the Valachan refugees to Barovia temporarily, but the tiger wanted her family to gain sapience too, much like she had. So they go back to the island, and they see that Dr. Fran's conditions worsened. He's even bigger now in terms of D&D rules. He's now the equivalent of a huge monster, and more bestial to the point where he can't even talk anymore. He just grunts and just full on acts like an animal. And he attacks and KOs Felix, almost like as if going in a frustrated rage. And there's a battle. And I use the custom stat block. I can't find the source, annoyingly, because I got the stat block ready years ago, even though this third visit only happened probably a couple of months ago out of game. I can't find the source, which is frustrating, and I've checked everywhere. If I find it, I will update the description. But it was quite a cool stat block. He could cast a few spells. He had like a tusk attack. I think it was kind of like artificer. I never can say that right. Artificer spells and things like that, and a few cool abilities it could do. I thought it worked really well. And they KO him instead of killing him, and then they're deciding, right, how do we save him? He's gone too far beyond now. The experiments are taking too much of a toll on him. And one of them says, we should investigate his room. I think he's got a journal in there, but usually it's off limits. But hey, we're trying to save his life, and he can't really protest right now anyway. So a bunch of them go upstairs with Felix, and they find in his room his journal that not only contains information about how to revert him back to his original state, but it talks about the experiments he did on his wife that ended up killing her. I think I got that from the original lore as well. So now they have a dilemma. Do they help him despite his past crimes? But if they don't help him, do all the animals risk losing sapience, or does he, something else bad happen? And while this is going on, one of the bears they made friends with was starting to lose sapience, and it was one of the first animals that Dr. Fran made sapient, suggesting that the sapience is actually temporary. So all the animals start freaking out, being like, oh god, if something happens to him, we're all going to go back to our original states. The lions and the wolves that are friends with the sheep and the cows are like, oh no, we're going to end up like, you're going to eat us. So the PCs decide to help him. They decide to use the sort of antidote process, or however it was described, and he reverts back to his original size, his original state. He's no longer bestial. He is a person again, but he's also, all the animals are still sapient. And they talk through options going forward, and he said, well, I'm not going to be around forever. What happens if I die? People lose their sapience. So they kind of, what's the saying, bump heads? And they realise that they know a bunch of beast-like people already, the surviving mongrel folk from Krezk. When we did Curse of Strahd, the abbot attacked and got a lot of the mongrel folk to attack, and there were only a few survivors, including Clovin, who was the abbot's assistant. And they were like, oh, Clovin would love to be an assistant to one of the scientists, we're sure. And so they realised that they might be able to not only have some of the mongrel folk help with the experiments, but then instead of Dr. Fran taking the brunt of the experiments with this procedure, they can potentially have some of the mongrel folk do it as well. And also, Dr. Fran knows now his limit and how he can go too far, so they'll always be making sure he's doing these things that revert him back to his original self. They also realise that the Valajan refugees need a home now, and realise that there's some ruined empty villages on the island, and they're used to fighting wild animals. And this island probably has a closer climate to Valachan than Markovia did. So they think, actually, why don't we relocate the Valajan refugees here too? So it's quite cool how it's almost like all these different groups of people moving to Markovia to help out. You had the mongrel folk from Krezk in Barovia, and then the Valachan refugees all living out happily on this island, helping Dr. Fran. And in terms of the Valachan refugees, they're there just in case there's any trouble on the island in the future. They could help out, or if Dr. Fran goes wild again, no pun intended, or if the animals lose sapience, they're there to help. And those are the 3 times I ran Markovia. I appreciate that it's a difficult one. You probably can't use a lot of the stuff I did. Like I said, it was very specific to my campaign and how I did things. Hopefully it helps to give you some flavour though, whether you just treat Markovia as kind of a mini occasional pit stop multiple times like I did, or actually flesh it out into its own campaign and make more of it. The next videos I've got coming up, next Ravenloft video I want to do is, so my players are in Forlorn at the moment, and I've just been preparing Castle Tristan Noira, if that's how that's pronounced, and they've pretty much done all the pre-castle stuff. Now originally I was going to do the Forlorn video after they do all of Forlorn. What I'm kind of thinking now is splitting it into 2 parts. The first part is just all the stuff up to the castle, and then the second part will be the castle. And I figure I'll do that because by the time I get to the end of the castle, I've forgotten how all the initial stuff played out, and that's all still fresh in my mind. The next session, which is tomorrow, should be the last sort of mini side quest they do before they go on to the castle. So it'll be ideal as the next video I do. So we'll keep an eye out for that. I'd also like to do a video where I talk about sort of good ally NPCs from old lore or the old novels you could potentially add to your campaigns. I did a similar thing recently with minor villains, recurring villains you can add to a Ravenloft campaign. That video did really well. It was a lot more popular than I expected it to be, which is really good. And so this is basically the good NPCs version, whereas that was the bad NPCs version. People from some of the novels, such as Scholar of Decay, I've forgotten the names, Death of a Darklord, and a couple of others, Tapestry of Lost Souls, is it called? Anyway, yeah, basically old NPCs from old lore and from other sources. I got, I think it's called Champions of the Mists from DM's Guild as well, and that has information of some that's quite cool to add. And I'll talk more about them and how you could add them to your campaign and where they'd be likely to be finding them and stuff like that as well. And we'll call it an end to this one. Thank you, Mist Wanderers.